they might be surprised at the result, and it might not bode well if they try to escalate. I don't think the PLA wants to try to fight the U.S. military right now. I think that they're way underprepared. They might have more ships, but they don't have the training. They don't have the experience. They don't have the wherewithal to deal with a full-up Western military. They haven't had a war since 1979, and the U.S. unfortunately has had several wars since then. And so I think it would be a grave mistake on their part. But if they do it, they might get slapped really hard, and the end result might be that they go back to the little cave and figure out what they did wrong, and all their planning goes out the window.
Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have a very special guest. As I always like to listen to military personnel, today we have an outstanding guest, is Guermantes Lailari, who goes by the nickname G-Man. Hi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Good. So since you're a specialist in military affairs, I would like to ask you first about the PLA. And as I listened recently to your talk here in Taipei, you mentioned the PLA Strategic Support Force, which plays a dominant role in what's happening with regard to Taiwan. So it means there is not only the military presence around the island, but also, for example, constant cyber attacks on the banks here. Could you please elaborate a little bit on this topic?
Yeah, so the Strategic Support Force was created a few years ago to consolidate a variety of different types of capabilities that the PLA had or wanted to develop. For example, many people might have heard about the three warfares: the media warfare, the psychological warfare, and the legal warfare. This was added to the PLA in 2003. Almost 10 years ago, and then it was later absorbed into the Strategic Support Force. So as you mentioned, the cyber attacks that are occurring against Taiwan, by the way, the same group of people is attacking many countries around the world, or checking to see what kind of vulnerabilities different parts of a society has. For example, you mentioned banks, media. These are all things that they would be interested in on the cyber side in terms of vulnerabilities. Every once in a while, they might test or do something that will make a country realize they're vulnerable. Besides the cyber side, there's also the media warfare that's going on throughout the media, let's say, spectrum, from YouTube, social media, to regular news, to all these different formats. And a lot of the propaganda that's put into these channels is derived from this Strategic Support Force.
Okay, so there is also a possibility of, let's say, not necessarily a military attack, but other scenarios. For example, let's say the PLA might shoot tons of missiles on Taiwan, not even invade it, and they say, do we continue, do you surrender? Or maybe there might be a power blackout, or, some malware on the internet. I also found a quote in one of your articles that you publish frequently. You said most likely scenario for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be a coercive quarantine. Could you elaborate on all those topics?
Right. So the coercive or the quarantine concept would be a phrase that the Chinese Communist Party would use to explain what it's doing against Taiwan, because a blockade they would not recognize, because a blockade is between two countries. And as your audience knows, the Chinese Communist Party does not recognize Taiwan as an independent country, which it is. And so what they would do is a quarantine. I believe that these different possibilities that they have of forcing Taiwan to become part of their territory, one method is through a blockade. And a blockade would be both airspace and sea. So in other words, they would set up a perimeter around Taiwan, both with ships and with air coverage, to control anything going in and out of Taiwan. The most likely aspect of that scenario is that they would prevent anyone from going to Taiwan via ship or by air unless they were pre-approved by the People's Liberation Army, the Communist Party's military force. So this method would create pressure on the government and the people. That's the idea, that they would create pressure, and this would be a means to force the government to capitulate. So there are a lot of ways that the Communist Party can apply pressure on the Taiwanese government and the Taiwanese people. And we've seen this over time. We've seen the boycott of, for example, fish or different products from Taiwan into China. And we've seen China do this in many other places around the world, for example, against Australia, or the most recent, maybe your audience might be interested, might be more aware of Lithuania, when they declared that they were setting up a Taiwan representative office as opposed to a Taipei representative office. Luckily, in that case, the Lithuanian economy only has 1% trade with the communist China, so it did not really affect them that much. And luckily, the European Union stepped in and supported Lithuania in that case. So there are a lot of means that the CCP is using against Taiwan to force them into becoming part of them. And another way is, for example, the influence that they're trying to do with politicians here or military people. There's been several cases recently of some military people who were caught providing information to the PLA about the military. So there's intelligence war going on, even though there's no war, but there's this intelligence aspect of it that both sides are trying to protect. Taiwan's trying to protect itself, and the CCP is trying to manipulate its access with Taiwan.
I think a quarantine might be a really difficult case for the West to react, because in terms of a kinetic or military attack, it's quite clear. But if there is a power blackout or quarantine, then it might take 2 or 3 or 4 weeks to react, and everything would be so, blurred. So I think that would be very beneficial to the PLA or to the CCP, and really, really difficult for Taiwan, because how could they ask for help if it's just power outage?
Right. And I think there's both pluses and minuses for both sides. If you mentioned the plus sides for the PLA, I'll mention some negative sides for the PLA. For example, they don't, one of the things that the CCP has observed, and most people have observed with regards to with Ukraine, is the long-term battle. The time has been a bad thing for Russia because they thought they could win quickly. All right. So the problem with a blockade is that that means it's going to be a long-term development, and that gives time to Taiwan's allies to gather their forces, to gather their policies. For example, they could the rest of the world could conduct an economic blockade against China for its actions. So there are some negative parts about this that they also have to consider, because, as I mentioned in my presentation that you listened to, one of the major strategic weaknesses of communist China is that they need a lot of food from outside to feed their people. And so if this blockade continued for a long time, and the West and many other countries didn't send them food, in a few months there would be people starving in China. So that's a negative part, that they have to balance that. They can't just set up a blockade and think that the Taiwanese people are going to give up. And in some respects, the other negative thing about a blockade from the CCP's point of view is the fact that it will help build morale in Taiwan against the CCP. So, you know, everyone here will have a common enemy, and it won't be so focused on, well, I can get a job somewhere else, or I can, it'll be very personal, and everyone will suffer. And so that will be a unifying action. And so, again, I can argue that the CCP might not do that because of that reason. So they're kind of stuck. I think that they're stuck in a quandary of how to deal with this. I think prior to the Ukraine war, they were pretty confident that maybe by 2027 or beyond, they could do something against Taiwan. But I think they're having second thoughts.
Okay, so that's a very valuable insight. I would like to continue with the CCP's or PLA's weaknesses, because you also mentioned in your speech that one of PLA's weaknesses that their services don't really work well together. They exercise it like a lot of experts say, yeah, US has a battle experience, China doesn't have. But some of my previous guests and your friends who have been on the show, they said, yeah, but the PLA exercises a lot. So they have a lot of really everyday experience how to run their machine. So, but their services don't work well together. The Americans have an advantage here. What other weaknesses do you see? You mentioned, for example, in your speech that in November they were supposed to fire 16 missiles, but only 11 were launched. And then the other one I would like to add is the idea where I disagree, because you mentioned Edward Luttwak and other people I know, they talk about the sex ratio, that there is, that Chinese parents might lose their sons to a war, and that might affect Xi Jinping's decision. However, this is the one where I disagree. I don't think he would care much. If we look at his record, he doesn't really care much. So what about
I agree that the CCP doesn't care about the population of China, in the sense that their only purpose, the CCP's only purpose, is to maintain their power or increase it. So yes, ultimately they're willing to expend soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen for achieving their objective. But where I agree with Edward Luttwak is that the notion that this is going to happen, let's say it's going to happen, is something that Taiwan and the rest of the world can emphasize in their propaganda against China by spreading the idea that your sons, which is the majority of their PLA, your only son, that the one-child policy that was started in 1980 and continued until 2015, which is 99% of all the PLA soldiers currently in service. The propaganda against China, communist China, would be, if you go to war, you're going to lose lots of sons, tens of thousands of sons, and your family will have no future. That's a propaganda point that I think should be hit. Now, whether or not the CCP cares is another issue. I agree with you that they don't care, and I think, but I think it could affect morale in the PLA. Okay, so that's and you mentioned the missiles. I was referring to the August missiles that after the PLA used the excuse of Nancy Pelosi's visit to conduct a military exercise, and prior to that event, the local newspapers mentioned that there would be 16 missiles fired, and only 11 were detected and landed in the different exercise zones. So many people talk about, this massive PLA military machine that's facing Taiwan. It's like a big giant, a Goliath, and in reality, it's not as big as you think. It's not as effective as you think, and everyone wants to emphasize the disparities between Taiwan and communist China. So one of my arguments is, for example, and many people use this argument, is that you can't have the entire military of the PLA attacking Taiwan. That is not realistic, because China is a big country. They need to maintain forces along their borders, including the borders that they have disagreements with. For example, India. They have a long border with India. They can't move those military personnel for occupation or attacking Taiwan. That's not realistic. So when you start whittling down the numbers of PLA military personnel that can actually maybe be available, we're talking several 100,000. We're not talking 1 million, which is the total number of the military. And people forget, okay, let's say several 100,000 of those military people are available. People forget that there's 1.5 million Taiwanese reservists. Okay, so that's a number. And then another number that people fail to understand is when you're defending your homeland, as in the case of Ukraine, which is a similarity between Russia and Ukraine and communist China and Taiwan, is when you're defending your terrain, your country, you're more motivated to fight. And so most analysts would say that the defender has a 3-to-1 advantage. And so in order for the PLA to win, they would need to bring, okay, if we have 1.5 million Taiwanese people, reservists, they would need to bring 4.5 million soldiers to win, which is not realistic. They're not going to be able to do that. So that's why I say people have to be careful about using absolute numbers in comparison between Taiwan and China, because all those forces are not available. But in the case of Taiwan, all those forces are available because they're defending their homeland. So that's a big difference. And you know, going back to the missile thing, if 11 out of 16 missiles worked, that's not a good ratio in wartime. And then your other question about joint warfare and other weaknesses associated with the military, you know, exercises do help develop skills for commanders and people who are involved in command and control or in moving and maneuvering. But things change radically when you start having people shot and when you have your systems break down. So exercises can only provide a certain amount of realism, but when you come down to it, it's a lot different in wartime. And so, for example, I don't know if you noticed recently, but Taiwan was approved recently for additional purchases of for AMRAAM, which is air-to-air missiles, additional AMRAAM missiles, and additional anti-radiation missiles. In other words, missiles that you can fire from an aircraft that will take out radars. So if just give you that scenario, that, and they already have them, but they're getting more, okay, like 600 million plus worth of them. So if Taiwan is attacked and Taiwan is able to use those missiles against radars, okay, that means that the PLA is blinded, okay, and if they're blinded, then they're not going to do too well crossing the strait and trying to take over Taiwan, and those AMRAAMs are going to take out those aircraft, or not only fighter aircraft but command and control aircraft, bombers. So their effectiveness goes down greatly. So again, exercises help play out certain scenarios and make people think about what could be. But as soon as things start happening, oftentimes the exercise just does not reflect reality. And so one of the big problems that people have is often exercises are designed to build confidence. And so if you in a wartime, if you're losing and you exercise that you always win, that doesn't do well for morale, and it doesn't do well for anything, and it actually will block your thinking. Exercises are useful, but they're not the final thing. And you mentioned a weakness on the joint side. So you also know that the United States government, the Congress and the president signed the
Yes.
late December National Defense Authorization Act,
Mm-hmm.
which for the first time since 1979-80, the U.S. government and the Taiwanese government have approved U.S. military personnel coming to Taiwan, up to 200 this year, maybe more in the future, which I hope so, to train and exercise the Taiwanese forces. And also it was announced that 500 ROC military personnel are going to the United States for training and exercises. So that's a deficit from the point of view of PLA, because now the Americans are helping the Taiwanese work together, not only between their forces, in other words, between the ROC Air Force, ROC Navy, ROC Army, but also between the ROC and the U.S. military. So that's combined operations. And the PLA does have exercises with the Russians or the Iranians and these kinds of countries. But the Taiwanese now will have some full-up training with the U.S., and which could lead to training with the Japanese, with the South Koreans, the Filipinos, and so this bodes well, and it's a deterrent in my mind for the PLA to realize that now the ROC is getting stronger and more effective and efficient when it comes to stopping any threats coming out of the PRC.
Yeah, since we mentioned the battle experience and then exercise experience, I know you also talked recently about the war versus peacetime dividend. So that could be interpreted as Taiwan's disadvantage, that people here are complacent. They don't really think in terms of war. When I talk to anyone, it's just, something in the future, and then the military and the Americans will take care of it. How do you see it in Taiwan? How much of a disadvantage is that, the peacetime dividend, and such a peaceful society? I mean, no nationalism, no hostility, unlike China.
So, yeah, I think over time, though, that's changing. Many Taiwanese woke up when the communists took over Hong Kong earlier than agreed upon between the communist China and the Brits. Their agreement said, they would wait, I think, 30, 40 years before they would change over. And then the communists said, no, we're not going to follow that. We're going to do it. We're going to do it right now. So several years ago, the Taiwanese saw what happened to Hong Kong, and they're also seeing what's happening in Hong Kong today, where people are not free. There's no freedom of the press. There's no justice. It's becoming, the laws in Hong Kong are now becoming more like inside of communist China. So that has motivated them to rethink their situation. What would a communist rule over Taiwan look like? And so that has motivated them to rethink their pacifism or their lack of motivation. So that's one thing. I would say a second thing was, as we mentioned, in August, when the PLA surrounded Taiwan and conducted missile strikes in not only Taiwanese exclusive economic zone, but also in the Japanese exclusive economic zone. And also the PLA conducted exercises in the Philippine exclusive economic zone, not missiles, but they conducted exercises. They closed off an area. So the Taiwanese were again woken up by the fact that the communists are not friendly, and they don't intend a peaceful transition. They have intent to do it forcefully if required. So this, I think, all these actions, I can give more, but these are several significant actions that have woken up not only Taiwan, but also woken up Japan. As you know, Japan recently in December published their new national security strategy, and they are going to double their defense budget in the next 5 years. South Korea is also increasing its budget. The Philippines is increasing their budget. Yes. All the countries surrounding China are now saying, things are starting to happen. And that's only because they did an exercise around Taiwan. And so these things, these kinds of things, these actions are thankfully helping people become aware of the threat that the Chinese Communist Party is to them, and it's not a peaceful rise of a superpower.